respond in our right to reply. And then the last matter I'm responding to is the rezoning request from Todd Generation for their 2 peaker plants. And given discussion and direction at yesterday's hearing on this matter, what I'll do, I'll state our conclusion up front first. So then yourself, the hearing panel and the submitters consider the next steps as we outline our evaluation, because I understand the different process that would play out depending on our conclusion. And also want to acknowledge that the evidence from Todd Generation for the hearing was helpful to inform this evaluation. As I said yesterday, based on the submission, there was limited information to be able to appear in the evaluation. So our conclusion at this point is that the 2 sites should be rezoned major facility. In our evaluation, our starting point was looking at the outcomes for the 2 zones. So we looked at the role and purpose of the 2 zones. So we noted the rural production zone provides for primary activities and other compatible activities, including resource extraction, such as quarrying and oil and gas activities. Also, that the effects of rural production activities are to be appropriately managed and mitigated, recognising the production-orientated working environment of that zone. And for the major facility zone, the purpose and role is recognising the large-scale facilities that are regionally or nationally significant, and to provide for the unique operational needs while appropriate managing effects. So that was our starting point in setting the scene. And also, in addition to the zones, we note it's important that there are a number of district-wide matter chapters which contain relevant provisions, namely the energy chapter, which specifically provides for electricity generation activities. We found Mr. Twiddley's evidence helpful in terms of its referencing to the Section 32 report for the major facility zone, setting out the relevant considerations where major facility zone applies, particularly his Table 1. And so what we've done in our verbal right of reply, and we'll do it in our written one, is we've included Mr. Twiddley's Table 1 and added a 3rd column with our own assessment of the five factors listed there. And what I'll do, I'll just go through our assessment of those 5 factors. So in terms of the first factor being the significant social, environmental, economic or cultural contribution to the district, region or nation, we looked, as we commented yesterday, we looked at the RPS for direction on that. And as I noted, there was, it does not fit under the description of a regionally significant infrastructure in the RPS. And I referred to the energy section of the RPS, and in the background to issues description, so the similar place where regionally significant infrastructure is described, it describes the Taranaki region as nationally significant in that it's currently New Zealand's only hydrocarbon producing area. It adds that Taranaki is also a significant contributor to New Zealand's electricity generation and distribution infrastructure, and then it refers to specific generation facilities in the region. And as Mr. Twiddley noted yesterday, McKee and Junction Road peaker plants are not specifically referenced in the RPS, and he added that that's because most likely that they predated, or sorry, they were developed after the RPS was prepared, which I agree with. While there's general recognition of the energy sector in the RPS, in my view, there's no specific direction in relation to individual sites or facilities that determine whether it's significant or not. And then secondly, in terms of the new coastal plan for Taranaki, the definition of regionally significant infrastructure, Commissioner McMahon just referred to it earlier, the reference from Mr. Twiddley last night. So in there, regionally, facilities for generating electricity are regionally significant. So McKee and Junction Road would be caught by that definition. So our conclusion for that point is that McKee and Junction Road are significant in terms of their role as peaker plants for the New Zealand electricity supply. The second factor relates to the large physical and operational scale and spatial extent of facilities. In our view, the 2 sites are relatively small, particularly in comparison to other site zones, major facility. This factor is where a judgment is required on what scale is major or large. In our view, these two facilities and sites are not large scale based on their spatial extent and the size of the facilities. The third point is, or third factor, relates to the highly specific nature of the operational requirements and associated environmental effects. We acknowledge the operational and locational requirements in terms of the proximity to major gas pipelines and high voltage transmission lines. We are uncertain about the nature and scale of the effects arising if the facilities were zoned major facility, particularly any future development. The submitted precinct plans appear to only provide for existing and consented activities and development. In our view, an exercise is required to determine whether the major facility zones provisions as they are effectively avoid, remedy or mitigate the adverse effects. In doing this exercise, we'd need to consider the context and environment for each site. In addition, on the environmental effects considerations of note, I understand from council officers that complaints have been received from parties near the Junction Road peaker plant, which may highlight the environmental effects are not currently being effectively avoided, remedied or mitigated. So I'm just raising there, we'll just need to look at the consent conditions that apply to that site, how they relate to the permitted activity standards for the major facility zone to do that exercise to make sure the objectives are being achieved.
Just on that, Mr. Wesney, does that issue go to the what the boundary might be for the zone and the sub areas within the precinct?
Yeah, to me that's all part of it in terms of defining the precinct plan, the zone boundary extent, and any variation to those specific provisions.
Okay. Thank you.
The fourth factor relates to the unique nature of the current and future development needs. And we acknowledge the current and future development needs as set out in the evidence. We query whether the rural production zone and the energy chapters also effectively and efficiently provide for these needs as well. And similarly, comment in terms of the last factor regarding provide for flexibility to accommodate processing improvements and technical changes. We acknowledge the evidence presented on that from Todd Generation, but we also query whether the rural production zone and energy chapters, whether they also already provide an effective and efficient framework to meet those needs. So considering those 5 factors, we agree with Mr. Twiddley's response to a question yesterday from the hearing panel that this assessment should be looked at in the round rather than seen as a checklist or criteria where one or more of these factors are to be met. In addition to the above assessment, we consider the criteria in the National Planning Standards for special purpose zones are a relevant consideration. So these standards direct, and this is where you're creating an additional special purpose zone in a plan. They must only be created where the proposed land use or anticipated outcomes of the additional zone meet all of the following criteria. And there's 3 criteria listed, with point 1 being significant to the district, region or country, point 2 being practical to be managed through another zone, and point 3 are impractical to be managed through a combination of spatial layers. So in our view, the 2 Todd Generation sites meet the first criteria, but not the second and third criteria, in that we consider the 2 sites can be practically managed through the rural production zone and energy chapter in the PDP. However, as the special purpose zone has been created in the PDP for large scale facilities, along with which creates a combination of a special purpose zone and precincts, we consider that would be a more efficient and effective approach in applying a special purpose zone as a standalone planning response. So as I said at the start, so overall, taking into account all the evidence presented, we consider this is actually a finely balanced matter, but our conclusion is that we consider it's most effective and efficient to zone these 2 sites major facility. We consider planning conferencing should occur to determine the precinct plan, the zone boundary extent, and any other site-specific provisions to effectively manage the adverse effects at each site. And just on a final note, Todd Generation highlighted no submissions were received in opposition to these rezoning requests, which is factually correct. However, I'd highlight 589 submissions were received with close to 8,000 individual submission points on the proposed district plan. In my experience with full district plan reviews, it is not uncommon for parties affected by rezoning requests to be unaware of such requests. For example, it is unlikely property owners review the summary of submissions to check whether a neighbour or nearby landowner has sought rezoning. So there's just, I think, some broader context there as to why there may be no submissions in opposition. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hamish. And David, did you have anything for Hamish?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. No, that's pretty comprehensive, Mr. Wesney. I guess just in relation to the last point, and I don't know whether you've checked this, and it's going to be subject to the rezoning hearings anyway, but in terms of the 4 sites that Greymouth have requested to be zoned major facilities, do you know whether any of those sites attracted further submissions in support or opposition?
Not to my knowledge, not aware of any further submissions.
Okay, you might just want to, well,
Yeah,
could you include that in the right of reply, because that'll be before the rezoning hearing. But apart from that, no other questions.
And Hamish, I don't have any questions on your right of reply either. Just thinking ahead about the planning conferencing, would that just involve you and Bronte and Cam? Is that as you see it?
Yes, that's the only parties that have on the submission points.
Yes. And are you happy to convene that without any directions from us?
Yes, I think it's fairly clear in terms of when you're applying some site-specific provisions.
All right. Well, let's if you can take charge of that, and obviously organise that and include the response from the conferencing. There is an Environment Court minute about conferencing, I think, which really does sort of lay the ground rules for this, which I presume you're familiar with. But obviously, if there's agreement, we'd like to see that. If there's not agreement, we'd just like to have the reasons spelt out, and then we can go from there as decision makers. Thank you. And my last sort of comment really is it's quite a special skill to be in this 42A role. You're doing a lot of work on the background quite often without all the information in front of you when you prepare your report. You've got to be quite agile and flexible, listening to evidence and listening to it with an open mind, and then quite quickly coming back with a verbal right reply. That is a skillful job and a very important role. And I'd just like to thank all of you doing that role, Bronte, Hamish and Jacob. Really appreciate the way you come back to us, and particularly in short order, short time, you're doing this sort of on the, I think on the hoof is the saying, but really do thank you for your work in this regard. Are there any other questions before we close the hearing or comments? I'm looking at you, Stephen, in particular, Stephen Quinn, just in terms of process from here. You've heard the response from Hamish and the conferencing process. Does that sound satisfactory to you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the 2 options of process we outlined yesterday, we fall onto that option where we don't need to now, I think, reserve our right to reply in writing. We're comfortable with that recommendation and comfortable with the suggested approach in terms of planning conferencing with Mr. Twigley. So happy to go down that track, and I thank Mr. Wesney for the time and effort he's put into that overnight to get that response to us.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments before we close? All right, let's call it a day. 5:15. It's been two long days. I need to acknowledge you too, Christine. It's been a great hearing from an administration point of view. You've anticipated some of the questions for visual information coming through to us. I know you're doing this while you're trying to move a lot of other things on from an administration point of view. So you're doing an awesome job. I'd like to thank you very much. Sarah Mako, oh, Cam, just got your hand up there.
I was actually just giving Christine a clap.
Oh, a clap.
Yeah.
Okay. Well deserved. Sarah Mako, could you do the honor, us the honor of closing with the karakia?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Christine, you're doing a lot of cleaning up a lot of our mess too. All of the emails that go to the commissioners, so tēnā koe. He karakia whakamutunga, unuhia I te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatū. Koia rā e rongo, whakairi ake ki runga, kia wātea, ai rā, kua wātea, hau, pai mārere.
Yes, thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. 9 o'clock tomorrow, Sarah. And we'll see you, Maria, too, and Keith. And is Julie doing the hearing tomorrow, Christine?
Yes, she is.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Maria.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Stephen.